International law and the Tigray Genocide, Ethiopia, and paths to accountability. From New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy, June 23, 2026. Executive Summary. 1. There are multiple, widespread and credible independent reports that the conduct throughout Ethiopia of the Federal Ethiopian National Defence Force, ENDF, on behalf of Ethiopia, Amhara Regional Armed Forces and/or militia, Fano, and loyal groups, the Eritrean Defence Forces, EDF, as well as the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, TPLF, Tigray Defence Forces, TDF, and those loyal to them, have violated international humanitarian law and international human rights law. 2. There is a reasonable basis to believe that such violations amount to the commission of war crimes and/or crimes against humanity. These include numerous examples of inhumane treatment, such as that prohibited under Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, as well as violations of the requirements of distinction and proportionality in carrying out attacks. Correspondingly, the evidence suggests that Ethiopia has not made adequate efforts to discharge its obligation under customary international law, equally applicable in non-international armed conflicts, to investigate war crimes committed by its nationals or armed forces, or on its territory, and, as appropriate, to prosecute the suspected perpetrators. 3. This report has considered in particular whether some or all of this conduct potentially amounts to genocide. This is significant because genocide not only occasions individual criminal responsibility, if proven, but also the duties and associated responsibilities of states notably under the Genocide Convention, of which Ethiopia was an original signatory and, from July 1, 1949, is a ratified state party. Likewise, Ethiopia bears corresponding obligations under customary international law. 4. This report concludes that, on the evidence currently available, there is a reasonable basis to believe that members of the ENDF, the Amhara Special Forces, ASF, and the EDF have committed genocide against Tigrayans. 5. There is a reasonable basis to believe that at least some members of the ENDF or civilian officials associated with the Ethiopian federal government, the ASF or civilian officials associated with affiliated militias or the Amhara regional government, and the EDF possessed the intent to destroy Tigrayans as an ethnic group, in whole or in part, as such. 6. With the intent described in this report, there is a reasonable basis to believe that EDF, ASF, and ENDF members carried out at least 4 acts constituting the crime of genocide, killing Tigrayans, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting conditions of life upon Tigrayans calculated to bring about their destruction, and imposing measures intended to prevent births among Tigrayans. 7. There is a reasonable basis to believe that at least some statements reportedly made on social media by certain individuals also met the requirements for direct and public incitement to genocide, and were again made with the requisite intent. 8. While it may not necessarily be the case that there was a formal plan for any of this conduct to occur, or that senior officials were necessarily involved in these acts, this does not preclude the possibility that these acts may be attributed to Ethiopia, occasioning its responsibility as a state. 9. Furthermore, even if the genocide took place at a grassroots level, and irrespective whether it may be attributed to Ethiopia, there is in any event also a reasonable basis to believe that Ethiopia as a state failed to discharge its responsibility under international law to prevent such acts. This failure contributed to and perpetuated the situation of manifest and serious risk that acts of genocide would occur. Likewise, there is a reasonable basis to believe that Ethiopia has not discharged its responsibility to punish such acts. 10. In any event, and notwithstanding questions of state responsibility, the individuals responsible for the serious acts described above may themselves bear criminal responsibility. Indeed, even if the conduct in question were considered not to meet the requirements of genocide, it is highly likely that it amounts to war crimes and/or crimes against humanity, including offenses of particular gravity and breadth. These include persecution and other inhumane acts as crimes against humanity, and the war crime of starvation by depriving civilians of objects indispensable for their survival. 11. Accordingly, states should Recognize that there is at least a reasonable basis to believe that genocide and other related acts were committed in Ethiopia against Tigrayans, and that responsibility for these acts may be attributable to Ethiopia as a state, and recognize that, even if Ethiopia was not responsible for the genocide and other related acts, there is at least a reasonable basis to believe that it failed to prevent or punish such acts committed on its territory. Conform their bilateral relations with states, including Ethiopia, to the state of affairs set out above. Take appropriate action in light of their own obligations under the Genocide Convention, including, as appropriate, instituting proceedings before the International Court of Justice under Article 9. Take appropriate action in multilateral fora to secure an international, impartial, and independent criminal investigation of such acts by the International Criminal Court or any other suitable mechanism, and exercise universal jurisdiction, in accordance with applicable domestic law, over individuals implicated in the commission of genocide and other related acts, as well as other core international crimes such as crimes against humanity and war crimes.
So what does this tell me? No matter how far we think we are from each other and how different from the other, we are all very intimately interconnected. In spite of this, however, news regarding some people in the world, some parts of the world don't seem to be worthy, has been completely muted because we don't believe in our interconnectedness. I was born and raised in Ethiopia. I'm of Eritrean descent. And there's currently a genocide in Ethiopia. There is a civil war accompanied by a genocide. It's an estimated 500,000 people have perished in the last 18 months in the northern state of Tigray. 7 million people are under siege. No food, no medicine, no internet, this whole entire time. Tens of thousands of Eritrean refugees are unaccounted for. The Washington Post writes, the world's deadliest war isn't in Ukraine, but in Ethiopia. So David Volodsko writes in The Nation, if we compare the situation in Tigray to other ongoing armed conflicts, the numbers are startling. Looking at civilian deaths, for example, the war in Ukraine has resulted in less than 3,000 Ukrainian deaths, according to the UN Human Rights Office, while Tigray has seen upwards of 500,000, as per estimates by Ghent University. However, how many of you have seen it in the news? Show of hands. Like 3. How many of you have seen people changing their profile pictures to stand in solidarity with Tigrayans? Let's not forget that we are all so intimately connected. What happens over there will come to our door one way or another. When I started speaking up about a genocide in Tigray, calling it a genocide, I got incessantly attacked and harassed online. But that was not the most difficult part for me. The most difficult part was seeing the silence, minimization, denial, and false equivalency by many Ethiopian and Eritrean intellectuals. Intellectuals, you would hope, would loudly condemn this in a united voice. It became really hard for me to speak to some of my own relatives or even longtime friends. It took me a long time to wrap my head around what's going on. I'm still extremely disturbed seeing genocide denial in action. But what consoles me is that there will always come a time when you feel lonely if you stand in the right side of history. That's the whole point. If that wasn't the case, then there wouldn't be a need to speak up. You may find your community for collective action, but you might still find yourself lonely in terms of how whoever you consider to be your community acts. You might find yourselves at odds with everyone else in your quote-unquote community at times. So a journalist and Nobel laureate Maria Ressa said, you need to actually live your values when it matters the most. Not when it's convenient, And the true test of your values is when you stand to lose something.